This episode is brought to you by Ardan Labs Education. Sign up today to learn advanced concepts in Go, Docker, Kubernetes, Terraform, and more. Visit ardanlabs.com/education for more information.
Welcome to the Ardan Labs podcast. Our special guest today. Oh, and I've been wanting to talk to this person for a long time. So if you see me on the YouTube shaking, it's because I'm shaking. Actually, I got goosebumps here. Matt Boyle. Matt, I can't believe that I finally got you on this show.
That's quite an introduction. Nice to meet you, Bill.
Hi, Matt. Where are you coming to us from today? How else do you say that? Every time I ask that question, Eric, I feel like I'm saying it wrong. Where are you coming from today? There's something weird about that. But anyway, Matt understands what I'm asking. So
I know what you mean. So I'm based just out of London, outside of London in Surrey. So it's still in Greater London, but not in London, if that makes any sense.
okay. So just outside the city bounds or whatever that is.
Yeah, so there's like the City of London, and then we have like the Tube network, which I think most of us deem as like Greater London. As long as you're on the Tube network, you count as London for.
So what is that? 1, 2, 3? You're not like as far out as Wembley, isn't it? Like a 3 or something?
Yeah, it actually goes all the way out to Zone 6. I'm on zone. I'm Zone 3, I believe, but I'm
You're Zone
south.
3.
So
Okay.
Wembley's in the north. I'm in the south. Yeah.
Eric is almost impressed that I knew a little bit about zones.
I'm impressed. I'm very impressed.
I hardly travel outside of Zone 1, right? So that's cool. I've been to Wembley though. I saw an NFL football game there. I don't know, 5 years back. So Wembley was actually impressive. The way they got rid of all of those people, the tube would just show up. I don't know, 1,000 people would get on, and before it, like right after it left, the next one came in. Super impressive.
Wembley's is a really cool arena. It's and NFL has become more and more popular in London too. I think they do 4 games a year here now, and I think they sell them out every time. People come from all over to go and watch it. It's really cool.
And it's wild because, like, you know, I'm a Miami Dolphin fan from Miami, and you're there and you see every team represented. So there are jerseys like every team, and I started going up to people and asked them why this team, like why you were, and it was like this was the first team I saw on TV when we started watching. So they like got an affinity to that. Though the Raiders always had a lot of people because their uniform is cool, like it's black and it looks like a warrior. So I think a lot of people gravitate.
Are they based in Las Vegas? Is that the Raiders?
Now they are, but back in the day they were in Oakland, California, which was a fairly tough neighborhood to begin with. So they always had that tough persona. Like Miami has the Dolphins. Like nobody wants to be a Dolphin. Right? So you don't see any Miami jerseys around. All right, cool. So look, Matt, this podcast is about you. I want to kind of get a sense of your journey through tech and all the things you've done. But before we start that, give everybody a couple minutes on what you're doing right now today.
Sure. So I currently work at Cloudflare. I'm an engineering manager in an organization called Engineering Productivity and Planning. So our team's goal is to make tools that makes it easy for other engineers to be as productive as possible. Also to solve cross-cutting concerns. So if there's things that lots of different engineering teams are solving in different ways, we'll try and centralize that problem and solve it for them in the best way possible, all with the goal of making it easy for people to build the right things in the right way and to kind of move at pace without, the old Facebook mantra of move fast and break things. Our goal is like move fast without breaking things. I think we can have both, and that's what our team aims to do.
So like the organization is your customer in this role here.
Exactly. Our customers are other engineering teams for sure.
That's an interesting sort of role. Do you enjoy that? It's like I never enjoyed when I was in IT shops, because this is the only time I've kind of heard of this, right? Where your customers are like employees and internal people. And I don't know, I never liked that. I always liked the idea of somebody outside the company being my sort of customer. How do you feel about that kind of role and that customer?
I personally love it. So my team doesn't have a product manager, so I guess by proxy, I'm the product manager. We kind of share it as a responsibility between other engineers in my team too. But whenever we see an inefficiency or we see something that a team's doing great or we think could be better, I have direct access to all the people that I need to quickly make a decision and potentially make a project around fixing it. And so, we're really empowered to go and fix those things and, have access to a bunch of metrics and data so I can really track the success of projects like really granularly. So, if one thing that I worked on recently was a tool that we called Gaia. Gaia was the mother of creation, and we built a service to help generate other services, very meta. But, if you wanted to build a Go app and you wanted to put it in production, like teams were spending sort of a week or two to be able to do that, and they were not necessarily building the best practices because they were just doing it the way they did it previously. So we made a project. The goal was to allow you to generate a Go service and put it in production within 30 minutes. So we measured that over time, and my record is now down to 7 minutes. So if I'm going from having an idea that I want to put in production to having it running in production, it's submitting metrics, it's deployed in Kubernetes, it's got all the network policies set up correctly, 7 minutes, which I think for an organization of Cloudflare's size is really, really impressive.
No, I trying to do that with that starter kit that I have, right? Like, here's everything you need. You should be able to get it up and running in Kubernetes almost instantly. It doesn't do anything, right, just yet, but it's got everything you need, like you said, the observability and the debugging and all that stuff. So I think those types of starter kits are critically important.
I love your ultimate Go service. I think it's something that most ecosystems are missing, because I think a lot of frameworks and tools that they have the hello world example, and it's like, here's how to write this and here's how to connect to a database, but no one ever talks about metrics and observability and logs and how to do all these things well. And unless you are very fortunate to work for a big company where they get to the scale where they use Kubernetes and have some of these problems and you get to solve them, sometimes people just never get to see them, and it's kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? You can't get hired at that company because you don't know how to do X, and you don't know how to do X because that company won't hire you. So having stuff like yours available where you can spin up Minikube, you could deploy a couple of Go services and play with it to give you that experience, I think is really, really valuable.
And then you walk into the interview and at least you can have an intelligent sort of conversation around it. So yeah. Okay, I did have this question. Because you were like, when we identify, how does an internal group identify that a majority of teams are having a particular problem? Is it because you're getting called? Explain that, because that's interesting to me.
That's a great question. There's a bunch of different ways. So Cloudflare specifically is very big on internal documentation. We have a huge wiki where everything goes. So if you're writing a specification on what you're going to build, or you have an idea on how to do something, internal blogging is very much encouraged. So Cloudflare is very popular for external blogging platform, but we also have an internal one. So I spend a lot of time perusing that, reading what people are thinking about, what the problems are. Cloudflare is very public with our incidents, again, both internally and externally. So that's something we can read to figure out. There was 3 incidents last month, and all of them were caused by misconfigured network policies. Like, why is that happening? Like, let's dig into that a little bit more, and I can reach out to the engineers or the engineering manager to understand, like, what they've identified as the reason it happened and what things can be put in place to make sure that doesn't happen again. We have something that we call chat ops, which in our chat tool, we have rooms available for each service, and people may ask questions in there. Or ask for updates or help with specific things. So we can kind of lean into that too and see how, what people are struggling with, what they're finding hard, what's the lots of questions about. And then the final thing is exactly as you said, like just people reaching out, like, we need this tool or we need help with X. Cloudflare plans in sort of quarterly cycles. So we kind of move as a company together. We have like one goal for the quarter and we all work together towards that. So there's a point in time, which is going to happen next couple of weeks actually, that for next quarter, all of the engineering teams will outline exactly what they're going to be doing for the next 3 months. And so for someone like me, that's a really great time to jump in, read what everyone else is up to, and look for cross-cutting concerns and see where we can jump in and help.
All right, I got to ask at least one more question before we start this, because was this group already existing when you joined Cloudflare, or is this? I'm kind of curious how this group came into being, because it seems like it's such a valuable team, and I've never heard of anything like this before.
Yeah, so I think other companies have something similar, but the kind of idea of platform engineering is relatively new, and that's what I would call, as I'd say, we're a platform team. this team did exist in some shape when I joined Cloudflare. I joined the team which I am now the manager for a few years back. We had a slightly different remit there, and we were more focused on um, the phrase we used was customer facing common abstractions, which isn't very clear. It's very abstract in itself. But the idea was, if you think of something like audit logs, every service at Cloudflare needs to emit audit logs. So rather than every team build an audit log system, let's build a central platform and let teams send their audit logs towards us, and we'll manage that platform for them, so they can focus on the business outcome, and we can focus on sort of those pieces around it that are super valuable, but you don't want every team to have to build. And then as we've kind of grown as a company, we've split that team into two. So we have another team now which focuses on specifically that alerting and audit log side, and then my team now focuses a little bit wider remit in terms of focusing on not just the common problems that engineering faces, but just this is kind of more a little bit of me that something I'm really passionate about and I've really pushed for my team to have a remit in is that engineering productivity and engineering happiness. Like I think those two things go very closely together, and so that's something that I've kind of pushed for our team to have a little bit more pulled into our charter than typically would have been there. So, one thing Cloudflare does do really well is that if someone's excited about something or passionate about something, you can quite often make a case to spend time building for it if you can frame it in the right way.
I've heard the term platform engineering before, so okay, now that term can make more sense to me. Sometimes you hear these terms and you're like, I have no idea what they're talking about, but it sounds impressive. Uh, so that's cool. Okay, I'm gonna put you in the time machine here just a little bit, and I want to try to age you a little bit. So I'm imagining that you grew up in England, so grade school is a little different than what I know in the US, but usually around 17, 18 is when you would have that option to start university. So, like, what year was it when you were like 17 or 18?
So I went to university in 2011.
2011. Okay, that's a good marker for me because that will give me an idea of tech and kind of where you are. Okay, here we go. Are you ready? First question. Don't think too hard. Don't, Matt, you're already thinking too hard here. No, I want that first memory you have of doing something on a computer where like that light bulb went off or that joy or you made it do something like that first memory.
So interestingly, two came to mind. The first one is probably I always remember getting a really old computer and installing Windows 98 on it, and there was 100 floppy disks, and you had to keep taking out floppy disks and putting new ones in. And I always remember I used to just uninstall Windows and install it again because I just thought it seemed really cool that I could do that, and it made me feel like was really grown up because I'd have been pretty young at the time. But yeah, I remember doing that as the first thing. It's really interesting. That was the first thing that came to my mind.
Whose computer was this that you kept uninstalling it? Like, was it your computer or the family computer?
It would have been a family computer, but I
Yeah.
don't. I don't think honestly there wasn't much engagement from my family with computers until we were all quite a bit older. To be honest, like I don't remember really being in high school until anyone really showed any interest in the computer, and that's when you kind of had to start paying attention to it and getting into it. I think.
But you had one in the house, so how did that computer get into the house?
Yeah, I think it was bought for my brother is a couple of years older than me, and I think it was bought for him going to high school because we knew it would be needed. Um, and I think that he was the first real one who kind of, I guess, had tech literacy, if you will, and I was just kind of copying him and wanted to figure it out too.
What a way to get them back. Just uninstall Windows and hide the floppy disks, and you get what you want.
I have another memory actually, which I think this is more interesting because this is the one where I think to me it really sort of inspired me to be like, okay, I want to go and learn about this a bit more. But I remember there was a video game that I was stuck on, and I couldn't find. I was looking around on supercheats.com, which was the website at the time I always used to go to try and find help for video games, and I couldn't find an answer to my question. And I remember going to a forum and like writing out in probably terrible English that what my problem was or where I was stuck on the game, and someone else replied to me, and I think that was my first sort of real sort of wow, like the internet is insane. Like I can ask questions into a void and like people answer me back. And for me, that was a real wow moment, I think. And I think that's the one that really sort of drove me forward. And I started hanging around on these forums and answering other people's questions and stuff. So that's the first real memory I have that was like really inspiring of like what the internet could be, I think.
But do you remember how old you were at that point?
I'll have been
And you had internet at home already, or dial? Well, what year did you say you started university again? 2011, right?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, all right. So you probably, yeah, you had internet at home already, and
We had dial up for a while. I definitely remember the dial up tone and someone picking up the phone and it ruining the connection, driving me crazy. But I don't remember exactly when we got broadband, but we definitely had it before I went to high school.
I remember buying the second line just for the modem at one point, just to just to stay out of trouble with. At that point, it would have been my wife. I was married by the time I had the dial up in the house, so I had to have the second phone line. All right, so talk to me a little bit about sort of those years before kind of the university. Were you How much time were you really spending on computers? Were you more interested in anything else? Kind of what was Matt doing in his formative teenage years?
Yeah, so I was listening to some of your other interviews with people on this ahead of this, and all of them pretty much said that they spent tons of time programming and stuff ahead of going to university or taking a role. And I must admit, I'm the complete opposite. I probably shouldn't admit this, but until I started my computer science degree, I'm not sure convinced I knew what computer science really was. Like I think I had misconceptions about what I was signing up for. But I was always interested in computers, but from the angle of I liked video games. I spent a lot of my formative years playing a lot of video games, like many all nighters playing them. And I always wondered how to create them, but I didn't really take any actionable steps to do so because I didn't know how. Like I didn't really have a mentor or anyone kind of to look to for that sort of thing. So I spent a lot of time in my formative years playing video games. I also was and still am a big reader. Um, Maybe we'll get onto it in a minute, but I actually had a really hard time getting into university for computer science because I didn't actually study the right subjects. To get into computer science, I think in the US too, but it's kind of expected that you study maths, physics, and something along those lines. Whereas I actually studied English literature and history. And so I had to actually write to universities to beg them to take me for computer science because I didn't have the correct subjects or background that they wanted for someone to kind of take that course.
So let me ask you because that's interesting. So when did you realize that you were going to have a problem getting into a computer science? I mean, you have to take tests. I don't know how it works in England, right? Like in the US, you take your SAT, and that SAT score basically drives what universities you can go to. But I don't ever remember being isolated from one particular major or another. It was just like the score and if there was room in that college, let's say for that program. But how did that work in England then?
Yeah, so in the UK, there's kind of 2 points you can leave school. One is at 16. So at 16, you have to do. They're actually changed the name now, so I'll be showing my age a little bit. But they used to be called GCSEs, and these were like standardized tests that everyone's did. So I guess maybe the equivalent to SATs. And you did them across 11 subjects, which had to include English, maths, science. Based on the grades you got there, you could then apply to stay a little bit longer in high school and do something called A levels. And the A levels you did and the grades you get determine what universities you can get into. So typically, at A level is the first time you have to pick, basically to specialize, you have to pick 4 subjects, of which you have to kind of submit grades of 3 of them to your university for a place. And quite often, the universities in the UK, for example, Oxford, when I was looking at universities, they'd say to study computer science, you need to have 3 A's. One is in maths, one needs to be in physics, and then one can be one whatever you like. But you need an A in maths, you need an A in physics, and then you have to do an interview and stuff. And if you pass that, you'll get in. So when I was 16, I was given basically the choice, like pick the subjects that you want to specialize in, and that'll determine what universities and courses you can apply to. But I wasn't in a position at that point to make a decision about what I wanted to do with my future. I wasn't really aware of what jobs were out there. And my school was a little old fashioned in some ways, I would say. And they kind of really promoted what we call the classics, like the philosophy, politics, economics, English literature, history, music. And I was very good at English literature and I was always interested in history. So I really kind of prioritized those subjects because they were what I was good at, they were what I was interested at. So I picked to do English literature, history, IT, at A level. We can talk about IT a little bit in a minute, but it's not computer science by any stretch. So I did A levels in those three subjects. I got really good grades in them, but then they're not the right subjects to study computer science because I didn't have the maths background that they were looking for, and that would come back to bite me a little bit in the first year of university.
So I find it interesting because when did you finally commit that you wanted to go into computer science? Like by the time you were done with all that testing and schooling, or
No, so when I was about 17, so halfway through my A levels, so 1 year in, they start to ask you about applying to university and what you're going to do next, and they start handing out these prospectuses of all the universities and all the courses they offer and the requirements and stuff like that. And so I was flicking through them, looking for degrees that were interested to me, and I looked at the English ones, but when you started to specialize in English and history, it didn't sound that interesting to me anymore. I didn't want to become an expert in the potato famine. Like, it didn't appeal to me. But when I read the one for computer science, and there was one specific course which was it was actually computer science with artificial intelligence, which is very, very relevant today, I suppose. And that really grabbed me. It sounded so interesting, and they. In all the sort of adverts and the prospectus, they called out that some of their graduates had gone on to build video games and the sort of video games they built, and that really caught my attention. And so then I started looking at what the expectations were to get into some of the top universities for that degree, and I didn't match the expectations at all. Like, I didn't have the right. I was going to get the grades, but they weren't going to be in the right subject. And so that was a real.
So then what did you do? You just went into university for the literature and said, I'm going to try to do it when I'm inside?
No, I actually wrote letters to all the universities telling them why they should accept me anyway. And it worked. It worked. So I think three of the ones I sent a letter to, and I got my form tutor to like vouch for it as like a character reference, if you will. And three of the universities said, we'll consider you if you do this sort of test, which was basically a logic test, if you will, to see that even though I didn't have a maths background, could I figure out from first principles some of these sort of maths puzzles, if you will, that at the time seemed really strange because I didn't really understand why they were asking me these things. But in hindsight now, I definitely understand why what they were looking for. They were looking for that logical thinking, and it does make sense. Thankfully, I did okay on those exams, and it was enough for them to consider my application. And as long as I got the grades in the subjects that I was studying, they were willing to accept me. So
that's awesome.
I'm one of the So I'm one of the few. I was one of the only people in my degree class who just didn't have like maths or physics as an A level, which I say did definitely bite me a little bit, but I worked hard to catch up, and it all worked out in the end.
I got two questions. Did somebody give you the advice to write these letters and reach out, or was it just you saying, I'm going to do this because this is what I really want?
I think my form teacher advised it at the time. So I don't know if you have an equivalent of a form teacher in the US. I guess you do.
We have guidance counselors, if that's anything like that.
It's like a registration class where we go to say we actually showed up to school today. We'd have to go in the morning. And
they call that homeroom.
Okay, yeah. So it's like my homeroom teacher or person, I guess, who advised me. And I don't think she thought it would work either, to be honest. It was like a last-ditch effort sort of thing. But as I say, it worked out, so I owe her one.
I mean, you must have felt that first year must have been really hard, right? Because you're walking in there you're kind of behind the moment you start. Because the classes are assuming already that you have this A level in these subjects, and you haven't even seen a lot of that material to begin with.
Yeah, 100%. I remember I'll always remember. I think I talk about this often, but I'll always remember in the first programming class we were learning Java, and there was this line, and it said turtle the turtle equals new turtle, and I was just staring at it, and I was like, what the hell does that mean? How can anyone possibly understand that does something? And there's people in the class who had built entire applications. There was some that were like contracting on the side, and I just felt, honestly, like people talk about imposter syndrome, but I really didn't feel like I should be there. It was awful. I really hated the first, I would say, 6 to 8 weeks. As I found my feet, I also had to take a foundational math class to kind of try and get myself up to speed with the things that I hadn't done, because in the second year of our course we kind of did an advanced maths class, if you will, which was like, maths for computer science effectively. So they were kind of needed to get me to a certain level. So I had to do that as well, which was very tough for me because it had basically been, 2-3 years at this point before I'd done any sort of maths, and it was a lot easier than what they were asking me to do at this point.
But you got through it. I mean, I'm assuming you got through it. Did you end up graduating with a degree from that university?
I did really well in the end. I did graduate with a degree. I got a first class degree as well, which is the highest you can get in the UK. So I did really well. So I think it was a good life lesson for me. I think it's just you got to stick in there, and even when it's hard, just keep trying, and you'll figure it out. And there's definitely times when it was a grind. There's definitely times I wanted to quit, but I think I'm a better person for it. So would definitely advise anyone to do the same thing. Even if you don't match the, and this applies to applying for jobs as well. Like if you don't match the requirements, apply anyway, and then follow it up with a message to the hiring manager explaining why you applied and like why you think even though you don't match the requirements, they should give you a chance. And I think a lot of people appreciate that personable touch.
Did you get to? I was just talking to Andre Eriksson. He was saying like when he went to university in Stockholm that it was purely just kind of heads down engineering, math, physics, like no liberal art classes at all, really. Did you get to do anything from a liberal art perspective during that time to keep up your reading or your history or anything that you did enjoy? I mean, I'm not saying you didn't enjoy the computer science, but you know what I mean? Stuff you enjoyed prior.
Yeah, so I didn't do any formal classes or courses in it. I carried on reading, and to this day I've got a pile of books just next to me here that I'm always reading something. So I didn't take up any formal education in it because I just wanted, well, I needed computer science to be my 100% focus. So I made sure it was. In hindsight, I wish I'd made more, taken more advantage of the university's ability to, join random classes and clubs and meet people who like similar interests to you. I don't think there's a better time than university to do that, but I think I did what I needed to do to kind of get through it, and it did mean working a little bit harder than potentially some of my peers were. So some of those things fell by the wayside for a little while.
Is that a 4-year degree for that undergraduate degree?
It's typically 3 years. I made it 4 years because I took a break between second and third year to go and work. I think I remember you talking to one of your other, I can't remember their name, but someone else did the same thing. They took a year off between second and third year, and they went traveling for a year and went all over the place. It sounded really cool. Mine wasn't quite that exciting, but I took a year between second and third year to go and work, which actually led to my me getting an offer to come back, which kind of kickstarted my career. So that was really positive for me.
What company was this? Like an internship, or was it and what company was it? What were you doing at this job?
Yeah, so I did a year placement with General Electric, GE, but based in the UK here. It was it was an interesting job actually. So I was hired as an intern into their like car leasing business, and their car leasing business was building a bunch of applications to like help manage the leasing and financing of those leases and stuff like that. But they were just starting to. So GE was always a big outsourcer. They did all their development happened outside of GE, and they were just starting to bring it back in house. And they were starting to learn about agile development and trying to figure out how all that stuff works. So I got to just basically, spend a year hanging around with, a lot of really, really smart people with a company with very deep pockets that was giving me a bunch of training on how, engineering should work in the workplace. And that was the first time I ever heard the word DevOps, which was in like 2014. So I think that's quite impressive, really. Still some companies are working towards that now, but GE was already thinking about it in 2014, and they're effectively paying me to sit in training courses, learn about it, and see how we could apply it to projects. I learned a bunch. I really liked it, and as I say, it led to a graduate offer with them, which I took as well.
So you do your year, then you go back to university to do to finish your degree, and now when that degree is over, is that when you go back to GE? What happens there?
Yeah, exactly as you said. So at the end of our year internship, so GE has a big year long internship class they do, and I think there was about 40 or 50 of us, if I remember rightly, in the UK. And then they do what they call an assessment center, which is like a very intense 1-day interview process where you have to go through all these, I think it was like 6 or 7 different interviews where you play out different scenarios and stuff like that. And then they made an offer to I think it was 12 of us to come back full time after we finished our degrees, and I was fortunate enough to be one of those 12. Um,
So you had a job offer that was available to you in 12 or whatever that time frame, let's just say a year from now. That's wild to me.
oh, it was amazing. Going back to university, like a lot of my peers were really stressed about finishing their degree and trying to find a job at the same time, and I got the privilege, at least for a little while, of knowing that I didn't have to worry about looking for a job because I had one. All I had to do was focus on my studies. It wasn't quite that simple in the end because halfway through the year, GE actually announced that it was going to divest a bunch of its businesses. It was going to sell off a bunch of those businesses. And the business that I was meant to be going back to was actually one of the ones that was identified for sale. So I had a little bit of a scary moment there, but they actually after a little bit of back and forth, they agreed to honor my offer. So I did go back to work there, but it was to a very different job to the one I signed up for.
So what was that? So you graduate, you have this job, but new team, new tech. Where did they end up placing you?
This is where it gets interesting. I actually didn't go back to I didn't go back to a software job at all. So um, I ended up working for a business that was selling itself, so divestiture, and I joined the divestiture IT team. So I actually was working with a bunch of like project managers, and we were figuring out how to carve up different bits of G's business to sell them. And then I got to travel to all these different places and meet potential buyers, explain the IT systems, how they work, understand their requirements for how we're going to separate them, and then to kind of go back and figure out how to do those things. It was a very, very, very interesting period in my life. It was super interesting, and I probably will never get to do anything like that again.
I mean, you didn't really have a lot of experience about their business units and stuff. So how did you kind of come up to speed to be able to be speak intelligently at a meeting about this stuff?
I'm not convinced I ever did speak intelligently, but I got to work with some really, really, really smart people, and they really took me under their wing, and taught me lots of things, helped me figure out things I didn't know, and gave me way more responsibility than I would have got in any other job. Like there was times when I was kind of directly working with and negotiating like $2.5 million a year agreements that were going to last for 2 to 5 years. I got to travel all around the world and meet people, and it was a really great formative experience for me. I think I actually put that period in my life down to a lot of my success because I think it taught me how to communicate with people, like various stakeholders of all different levels. And I think that's underrated as a skill in software engineering, is like how important communication is. And I learned a lot about how to do that well there.
But imagine that at the time you must have been feeling like this is not what I want to do. This is not what I want to do. Like, wasn't that a recurring theme in your head? Like, yeah, it's cool. I'm traveling. I'm young, but it's not engineering, really, is it?
No, not all. And that was definitely something that entered my mind. But I think I was aware of the uniqueness of the opportunity as well, and I knew it wasn't going to last because the business was ultimately selling itself. I wasn't going to go with any of the businesses. So the job
Shelf life.
a life, yeah, had a shelf life. So I knew it was going to come to an end. So I just made the most of it while I could. I say I really enjoyed the traveling. Like I got to go to all these places that I didn't travel much as a kid. So like I hadn't been very far out of the UK, honestly. So that was really exciting to me. And I was working with people who, my manager was someone who'd worked in the company for 20 plus years. And, she was really generous with teaching me about everything, basically. She taught me tons of stuff that I think it would have taken me multiple years to work in other scenarios. I definitely was missing engineering, and I was tinkering on the side. I've always been a tinkerer, so I was always working on other stuff. And one thing that G does very well is it encourages everybody to kind of network with the other business units and speak to other people. So as I knew this was coming to an end, I'd already started kind of speaking to some people in aviation, GE Aviation, to try and identify like when this is over, to try and find a path to join the software engineering team in GE Aviation, which is ultimately what I did.
So you got a job over in the aviation, which has to be, let me just say this right. When I tell people I'm a software developer and they ask me, do you write games? I'm like, no, that's a whole nother level of engineering. Like I don't write games. I have no experience with that. So, right. And then I think about aviation and I'm like, yeah, that's a whole nother level of engineering. That's nothing compared to what I do. Plus all of the rigorous testing and certification and integrations. Like, tell me about, if what you can tell me about like the work there, because it had to be highly technical, right? And highly also proprietary. at the same time, right?
I don't think I wasn't working on sort of directly on the aircraft, so I can talk quite freely about what I worked on. So I actually ended up working in Cincinnati. I lived in Cincinnati for a year, pretty much working for GE Aviation, which is like where their base is. And I was in probably one of the, I wonder if it's one of the earliest platform teams there. And what we were building is a platform as a service within GE to allow teams to spin up their own developer environment to enable them to similar to what I'm doing now, honestly, to build the best practices in minds like within GE. So we had this platform where you could say, you know, I want we're starting a new project, and it would spin them up a private GitHub repo. It would connect them up to GE's DNS. It would put sort of like the access policies in front of it that we need. It'd give them their own Jenkins instance, which was Jenkins was cool at the time, not so much anymore. And that was the first time I started to really play around with containers and Docker as well. So, you know, it was a really cool opportunity. Again, it was a little bit more disconnected to me from where I am now, in that we kind of had these list of requirements that to this day I couldn't tell you where they came from about what the platform had to do. And we just spent sort of like a year building that out. And I kind of worked across the full stack. I spent a bunch of time writing Angular, which was my first time sort of writing production, if you will, front end code. Although I think a lot of people would challenge my code and say it probably shouldn't have been in production. As well as kind of thinking about how to spin up services using APIs, which was just not something I'd ever even thought about before. So it was a really great place to spend a year.
All right, I have a bunch of questions here. First of all, you glossed over moving to the States for that. Was that exciting to you? Was that something you wanted to do, is live in the States? I mean, you went to Cincinnati, and no, to be nice to anybody in Cincinnati, but I mean, it's not Miami, okay? So, so were you excited about moving to the States and excited about Cincinnati? And talk about that.
I was at the start. So the way I did it was in a couple of stints. So I think I did 3 months, then home for a month, then 3 months, and home for a month. It was to do with the way the visas worked. That's how I had to do it. So the first time I went, I was really excited, and to be honest, I loved it. I loved Cincinnati. I loved the work. I loved the people I got to work with, and generally, I like the American attitude to work. Like, it's very can do. Like, let's support each other. Let's get this thing done. Like, I really enjoyed my time there. It's like very culturally different. After that, the times after that were a little bit more challenging for me. Like, I don't want to make this podcast all political, but it was 2016, right? And Trump election was on. Cincinnati's a swing state. I struggled with some of the perceptions and attitudes of the people I met, and I found it a little bit harder to integrate myself at that time. I think it was a pretty tough point in America, right? Like, people were very split on that decision. So I didn't enjoy it so much after that. And people kept asking me for my opinion, and as a foreigner, I didn't really want to get involved in those conversations. I just wanted to stay out of the way. So it got a little bit tougher to be there, I think.
Yeah, Ohio is one of those important states where they tend to lean towards the winners every election. 100%, but yeah, and it's an early state, so I could totally see that. I remember going in that whole time too, when I would travel outside the U.S. Everybody wanted my opinion about those things too, and I was just like, I don't want to talk about this. Like, I'm not. It was tough. This is interesting to me because were you building this? You were doing essentially platform engineering, but was this for all the teams that worked for GE Aviation then, whatever they were doing?
Exactly. Yeah, we were building it for. I think at the time, I think there was 100,000 people at GE Aviation. It was a huge company, and I don't know how many of them were developers, but it'll have been in the thousands. And every team had their own way of doing things. And there was there was like 9 different ways to authenticate yourself, right? And there was a big drive to, like, we really need to get better at standardizing this stuff. We need to get better at making sure we're leveraging our scale to learn from each other, instead of just kind of spending years building stuff that already exists because we're not talking well enough. And building this platform as a service team, this platform team was our attempt to do that. It was, if you want to build a new app, go and speak to that team, or talk to their website or their API or whatever it might be, and they're going to give you the best way to do things today, and eventually, hopefully, the only way to do these things.
Yeah, but it's hard to do that when you've got people there this is a company where you have people there 20, 30 years, and there's little kingdoms that end up being created. So for you to walk in and say, no, we know best practices and you don't, and you're going to change, Like, you have to really politically be savvy to navigate those waters.
Yeah, and that's where I was very lucky because I think they knew that, and I think this team that was assembled was like the Avengers of GE Aviation Engineering. I think it was the people who were really well respected, that had lots of experience of leadership underneath their belt and lots of architecture experience, and I just got to hang around as the newbie and listen to how they sort of navigated some of these things. So I was very fortunate in that respect. It wasn't they weren't battles I had to fight. I just had to sit there with my IDE and program whatever was cool that week.
And I imagine that you were running your own data centers, or were you running in one of the cloud environments as you're building this platform?
It was both. So GE was on prem, and they'd made a decision that they were going to move pretty much 100% to AWS at the time. So a lot of the things we were thinking about is how do we make it easy for people to migrate to AWS when they're not used to doing that. They're not used to that workflow, and then we also had a bunch of requirements, as you can imagine, about we got the government's a big customer of GE, and so we had to use AWS's GovCloud, which was relatively new. So we had to be, thoughtful of all the considerations and concerns that come around kind of having such high-profile customers and important customers like that too. So we were still figuring out that stuff. It took a really long time, and I think even when I left, we hadn't quite figured all that stuff out yet, to be honest.
And you probably also had to basically bucket whatever this cost to the right teams, right, to their budgets. Like, even though it's usually all on paper, somebody wrote one check, but right, this team spent this much money this month. This team spent. I've seen some projects like that where the entire team's job is to make sure that every penny is taken out of the right buckets.
Yeah, that's right. Cost centers, left hand to right hand. That's what we used to call it.
So, how long are you with GE Aviation working on really what are the beginnings of sort of platform engineering?
So I was there for around a year, I think, just over. I think I spent near enough a year in the US, and I spent maybe 3 to 6 months, probably closer to 3 months, I think, in GE in Cheltenham, which is in the UK here. It's in the Cotswolds. Very nice place to live. And I was working on a slightly different project in the same team there. But I kind of, that itch we were talking about, like I was really interested in the startup ecosystem, and so far all my experience had been as giant corporate, and even though we're doing cool things, it's still, I read stories of teams shipping software multiple times in one day, and I couldn't even imagine how that worked. Like, I couldn't even see in my head like a path to do that, and I really wanted to experience that. So at that point, I kind of made a decision that I wanted to move to London. I wanted to go and work for one of these small companies, be scrappy and build things fast, and see what that felt like, and see what I could learn from that environment. So that's ultimately what I decided to do.
And that's what, like 2015, 16-ish?
It's probably around 2017, I think, at this point.
2017. So how do you find the startup that you want to work for? What's that process like?
So to be honest, I really struggled to find a job because my resume was a little all over the shop. Like, I'd spent a year doing this like divestiture work, and I didn't really know how to present that on paper at the time. It certainly wasn't software engineering. And then I had some experience doing some of the stuff in a platform team, but I think I didn't really know how to frame it at the time, because when I spoke to friends and asked to see their resumes, like, it was a lot clearer. Like, I did Java, I learned Java, I did this thing, I wrote a web service. Like, I hadn't wrote any of these traditional customer facing apps, so I was finding it really hard, actually. So I was very fortunate to have a good friend whose friend, or maybe it was his girlfriend, was a recruiter. She took my resume, she kind of made it look good for me, and said, "I'll send it across to a couple of my friends." And one of the people I got contacted by was a company called crowdcube.com, and I really loved what they were building. So I only actually interviewed for 2 jobs in the end. I interviewed for TransferWise, or Wise as they're called now, and I interviewed for Crowdcube. I wasn't successful with TransferWise. I was very naive and didn't expect the interview that they gave me. It was one of the the classic whiteboard programming interviews. I did not perform well on that at all. And then I spoke to this company, crowdcube.com, which the high level way to think of it is I think you have something in the US now. Actually, I forget the name of it, but the way I like to think of it is it's like Shark Tank, but anyone can put themselves on there. So you can be like, "Hey, I'm Bill. I run Ardan Labs, and we're raising $1 million so we can grow to the next level. And in return for investing £10, you get 1% of the company split between all the people that invest." And so you go on the website, you put.
So it's almost like crowdsourcing, the beginnings of crowd.
It's exactly what it is. Crowdfunding. That's
Okay.
exactly what it is. Yeah.
So is that company still around?
It is still around, yeah. They're still around today. They're very UK and Europe centric for now. I think they did have some US partnerships at the time, but I think you find a lot of the European and UK startups, specifically fintechs, have a really hard time breaking into the US. It's just such a different environment from a legislative and policy standpoint that it's a real struggle to do so. So I think there is a US equivalent. I forget the name of the platform. I should know it, but I don't think Crowdcube ever. I don't know if they ever tried to, but they never launched there.
So you start that company in 2017. What was your primary role there? Are you now back to doing, or you're doing software development on a team?
Yeah, so I was my job title was full stack engineer. So very much building everything front end to back end. But it was a very new stack to me. The front end was all. It was kind of a Frankenstein's monster of JavaScript frameworks. Like some Angular in there, a little bit of React in there, some TypeScript.
Lots
TypeScript.
of jQuery too.
jQuery, yeah, jQuery, you got it. And then their backend was all Laravel, which is not something I'd ever worked with at all before.
I'm not sure I even heard of Laravel. What is
it's
that?
a PHP framework.
Okay, that's why.
It's in hindsight, it's actually a very nice PHP framework, but me and PHP just weren't and still continue not to be very good friends, and I really struggled to get into the mindset, I think, to work on that stack.
So, okay, so what part of their solution? I guess that means you were working on their consumer-facing front end and or full stack. How many engineers were on that team? Was this the scrappy startup you were hoping to be a part of, where you had to do almost everything?
Yeah, it was. So we had, I think we had two iOS engineers. We had two people who were like front end engineers specifically and only focused on the web side of it. We had like 3 or 4 back end engineers, and then there was just me as a full stack engineer because I was insistent. That was my title, I think, if I remember correctly, because I wanted to make sure I could kind of play with both sides of it and figure it out as I went. We also had.
So let me guess. Let me guess something here. Let me guess something. Okay. You end up, I could be totally wrong, but you're going to end up taking ownership of product releasing and getting this thing running in AWS and all that. Do you end up being the person that's responsible for deployments and all that?
I don't actually. We did have a DevOps engineer there. I don't know if you spent any time in the PHP ecosystem, but it's not the easiest thing to. For what it's worth, like I certainly wanted to, and I certainly wanted to get better at the build systems and the deployments. But PHP, even today, if you Google like container image for PHP and compare it to a Go image, like they are worlds apart. Like a PHP image is incredibly difficult to get running.
I've done training for like almost a decade, right? So the majority of the developers I've trained over the last 10 years are PHP developers. So I'm in this PHP shop, right? These are some of the most brilliant engineers that I've ever trained. Like brilliant, okay? They know the operating systems inside and out. In my head, PHP is a scripting language, right? So I can't comprehend this. And at the end of day 3, I go to the engineers and I say, okay, I'm not trying to be mean here. I'm just trying to understand how you guys are this technical, this in tune with every layer of the stack from the hardware up. And they were like, Bill, have you ever tried to deploy a PHP app? That was their answer to me. And I was like, no. And they're like,
and that's the thing. Like if you do want to be good at PHP and you do want to be able to put the tooling together, like you do have to start digging into the operating system. You have to start building. You have to work at a pretty low level to get it all to work, and it's something I really struggled with at the time because I just didn't have the depth of experience to be able to do that. So We actually had one of the creators of Laravel working for us, and that was a huge advantage for me because they were really helpful, and they really tried to teach me everything that I asked. I was very curious, always asking questions. And they had this, they call it a dev box at the time. It was built on Vagrant, if you remember Vagrant. And that's how we were doing sort of local development. But I just had tons of issues with it, and me and PHP just never saw eye to eye. I definitely didn't see my future in that language, and so I didn't end up staying at Crowdcube too long because I just I knew PHP wasn't the language that all the cool, sexy startups were using, and I didn't identify with the stack. I found it really struggled to think the right way to work with that, and so it's actually there I started experimenting with. It was first Node.js and then with Go, and that's where I really found my feet and was like, okay, this is what I want to do. I like this language. This language makes sense to me.
You found Go on your own? Like, how did you discover that? Because they weren't using it at the shop.
So that we had a very, very small service that was using Go. It was a little tiny proxy layer between the web and the back end. And the head of engineering at the time, Rob, had written that. And I was asking him questions about it, and he was showing me little bits and pieces of it, and I just thought it was interesting. Like there was nothing more than that. It's just like, this looks completely different to Java. This looks very different to PHP, and some of the things he was telling me about how to write like idiomatic Go was super interesting to me. So that was enough to make it into my list of things to experiment with and see if it's something that I could do something useful with. And for whatever reason, me and Go have always got along. Like it makes sense to me. It works the same way my brain works, and it was a match made in heaven. And so it was at that point when I started to really feel like this makes sense to me. I actually started to look for roles that would let me use Go at work, which was what led to my sort of next move.
Right. So I guess you're there for about a year then,
Yeah,
and
perfect.
you start learning Go kind of on your own on the side. And then did you start applying for jobs, or you just this opportunity came sort of in front of you?
So I was applying for roles, but then I actually got really lucky that one of the companies that I knew used Go in London happened to reach out to me on LinkedIn at the right time, because I actually applied to work at Monzo at the time. Like Monzo were a big users of Go. I wasn't successful in their interview process, and so I was kind of a bit glum and looking around at other opportunities. And I had another fintech reach out to me called Curve, and I was successful in their interview process. And they were currently undergoing a huge replatforming project to migrate away from a PHP monolith to Go microservices. So that sounded perfect. That sounded like the sort of thing I should be getting involved with.
And you ended up taking that job. How long were you with that company? Because now we're talking like 2018.
Yeah, so I was at Curve from 2018 probably to about 2020. I was there for just under 2 years, I think.
Okay, 2 years. So were they successful in migrating off of PHP?
Somewhat. I think there's still PHP hanging around even today, but as a company and specifically in engineering, I don't think there was a better way I could have spent 2 years. Um, like when I joined the company, there was I think 30 people. When I left, there was about 250. I joined as a mid-level engineer. By the time I left, I was a lead engineer with, I think I had at one point I had 20 people in my team. Like the career growth I experienced in that time was ridiculous. It was absolutely crazy, and it was the high growth, fast paced, scrappy startup that I wanted. It was exactly what I wanted at the time.
When I first was told I was going to have direct reports, I was kind of excited about it because I felt like when I'm moving up in my career. But that excitement ended fairly quickly because I just, as you know. So, were you excited in the beginnings of having to manage people? Did that excitement stay with you? Did it become a drag? Like for me, I just didn't want to do it.
It was really exciting to start with, and then I realized, probably the same as what you realized is the impact it has on your ability to actually develop. It diminishes it massively, and by develop I mean program. But also, it's a lot more responsibility than I think I naively expected. Like all these people are looking to you for advice and for you've got to be their advocate too for promotions, help them grow as engineers and make cases for them and things like that. And I was only, how old am I here? Like 20, 26, 27. some of the people in my team were double my age, and I just did not feel qualified to give them advice. Like I wasn't qualified to give them advice. Like they'd seen and done way more than I ever would, and I think that was a good thing. It was a blessing in disguise because at the time I really struggled with it. But then I kind of began to realize that as a manager, your job isn't to know everything. It's to really lean into and leverage your team's strength to drive outcomes. And once I started to realize that, things made a little bit more sense. I think one of the challenges I had, and it's actually one of the reasons that kind of I ultimately probably left Curve, is I didn't feel that I could adequately do both parts of my job. I couldn't be a manager and a lead engineer. Like it was too much. And I was starting to get really exhausted. Just I was spending probably 12 to 18 hours a day working, wouldn't be an exaggeration, and I include weekends in that. I'll always remember working at midnight on Christmas Eve because we had this ledger that was, it maintained customers' balances, and it wasn't adding up correctly. It wasn't giving the right answers when people were adding to their balances. And obviously, that's critical for a fintech. It needs to be correct. And like that was a real turning point for me. That moment, like, wow, this is really impacting my life. And I need to really start to think about what I want to do in the future and what makes sense for me to do next. So I think it was an awesome place to spend 2 years. I really advise anyone to go and join a fast growing startup, and you'll learn more. I feel like I did 10 years worth of experience in those 2 years. And if you add up the hours, it's probably not far off, honestly. But it was worth it, and it's got me to where I am today. So I'll always be thankful for the time I spent there.
A majority of us, as we're younger, we put in those 50, 60-hour weeks, and everything seems critical at the time. And then when you leave the job and you realize you have no more responsibility for those things, it's like now everything just seems so unimportant. And then when you look back on it, you're like, that was really foolish. That could have waited another day. That could have.
It's definitely those.
Yeah, but it's hard when you're in the middle of it. It's really hard.
It is, and there's always, I think it's very easy to think you're more important than you are as well. It's like, well, I need to solve this because otherwise no one else will know how to do this, or like one of my team will have to do it, or whatnot. But as you say, that day you quit and you go and work somewhere else, and the company continues to run, and there's not even a miss in a step in engineering. You're like, okay, like maybe I wasn't as critical as I thought I was. And I think all of us go through that humbling moment at some point, and I think it's essential. I think you need to realize that you're not irreplaceable, and you need to, especially for me over the last couple of years, I've had a real wake up call about like how important it is to look after your health and to pay attention to that too, and definitely don't put work above sort of health and family. Like make sure you put those things first, and then work needs to come after that.
Now, I have a friend who ran a $5 billion mining company, and he always said that everybody's replaceable. Money solves a lot of problems. So you fire anybody that you need to fire. Don't worry about it. And he would rather throw extra money at the problem to get the right person in there to keep things going than to deal with the, say, toxic person or whatever that is, right? So I've always kept that philosophy in my head. Everybody's replaceable, and the company's not going to fold tomorrow. Somebody will step up and keep it running.
Exactly. You stepping down might be the opportunity someone else was waiting for. So it could be a positive thing overall for other people in the company and the company as a whole too, because someone else may get to have an opportunity to grow that maybe was thinking about leaving. So
you do 2 years there, which puts you at what, 20 now? 2020?
Yeah, 2020. That sounds about right.
And did you have another job lined up before you left? Like, what's the next thing you're going to do?
Yes, the next thing for me was Cloudflare. So this is where we're just starting to go into the pandemic. We're starting to make, at least in Curve, we were making voluntary decisions about whether we wanted to go to the office or not. Like we were being asked to like reduce our salaries because they needed more runway. They didn't know how the next couple of years were going to play out. Like especially as a fintech, like people were working from home, they weren't spending money. Like our numbers were dropping off overnight. So it seemed like a good time to hang up my boots, as it were. And so I applied to Cloudflare, and I guess the rest is history, as they say.
What group did you originally apply to over there? I mean, it's a big company. Cloudflare is a big company. Don't they also quickly, like, you manage like one of the, what are it, like top 5 companies dealing with internet traffic or something? Like Cloudflare is big.
Yeah, I think I can't remember the exact number, but something like 20 or 30% of the internet has Cloudflare in front of it. So yeah, it's definitely one of bigger companies. And it's one of the things that really attracted me about Cloudflare. Honestly, there's not many places that you can work on that sort of scale. One thing I love to say to people in interviews is when you're building big systems, they always say to you, don't worry about edge cases. Don't worry about the thing that happens 1 in a million times, because it'll probably never happen. And I'm like, well, at Cloudflare, that happens 3 times a second. So make sure you worry about it.
we were, yeah, because at that scale, it's right. The probability of happening goes up. So what
100%.
did you feel? Okay, so here's it. When I think about Cloudflare, I think, and the people I've met over the years that work there, I think like the tech interview has to be pretty difficult. Like in my brain, like my brain says I'm going to get really teched out if I kind of try to work over there. How did you feel going into that sort of interview?
I think there's some misconceptions about Cloudflare. I think obviously we're well known for being the like people think of Cloudflare as just a CDN, right? Or just like a reverse proxy that goes in front of everyone's website. But there's so much more going on within Cloudflare, and I would say there's probably a team for everyone here. And finding the team for you is kind of the key bit to making sure that your skill set aligns with the role you're applying for. Like, for example, right now we have a role open in my organization, in my team, in the developer tooling team. And the skill set we'd be looking for there is someone who's kind of similar experience, I guess, to me, someone who's worked building platforms as service, people who's run like tooling at scale or for different engineering teams. And as part of the interview process, you're not going to get grilled about how the internet works. You're not going to get grilled about the life cycle of a HTTP request or anything like that. They're going to be really interested in your experience, like why you're excited about developer tooling, why you're excited about Cloudflare. So I think the tech interview may surprise some people. I don't think it's as hard or as technical as some people might think. It's very similar to the process you may see at like Meta or Netflix or something like that. Like a typical process would you meet the engineering manager for the team you're applying for. They'd ask about your experience, go through your resume. You then do like a pair programming exercise, like the leak code style. I like to call it pair programming because I actually don't care if you get the right answer, and I actually don't really care if your solution is the most efficient one. I'm more interested in how we work together and that you can come up with a good, even if it's pseudocode answer. So we've passed people through our pair programming round who haven't even wrote compilable code. So that's one thing that I really like to call out as being a little bit different. We then do a system design. That's usually the place where people find it the hardest, to be honest, because we will dig into, I guess, first principle thinking about how these things might fail at scale, to make sure you can kind of think the right way about those things, and that's typically it. Then you get an offer. So if you're engineering manager or the team you're applying for, it's relevant for you to know in depth how TCP works or how the internet works. You may get grilled on those sort of things, but if you were to interview for my team or the developer tools team that I mentioned, you're probably not going to get asked in detail about those things. It's more interesting that you're passionate about Cloudflare and the specific space you're applying for. However, that's not to say that going into it I wasn't terrified, because I didn't know this. Interviewing, I had the same perception as you, that they were going to ask me tons of questions about complicated things that I probably didn't know enough about at this point. So the week before I had the first interview, I did a bunch of like Udemy courses, like really quickly on like networking and how CDN works and how TCP works and UDP works and how a request works and all this sort of stuff. And I'm glad I did it because it gave me more insight into the business, but like none of it was particularly necessary for my team I was interviewing for, to be honest.
I don't know if this is on purpose, it's a coincidence, or this is just kind of what you're passionate about, but every step of your journey has been in this sort of platform engineering sort of role. Is that on purpose? You really like being in this space, or is this just the opportunities that have kind of come your way?
It's pure luck, honestly. I never set out to do this, but I'm a big believer in optimizing for opportunity, right? And I think anyone who's been successful will tell you they had luck. They had lots of luck. And I think you can't make luck, but what you can do is you can increase the chances of being lucky. And the way to do that is just to take opportunities as they come up. And I think I've been very fortunate that seemingly at the right time, really good opportunities came up that really aligned with my skill set, and it's allowed me to make really great career jumps that kind of got me to where I am today. And then once you're inside a company like Cloudflare or any of the big companies, like I think the sky's the limit to move around and transfer if you want to. I'm very fortunate in that I love what I do, but for me, my first goal was to get in, and then worry about what happens next after that. But I'm very fortunate that I've landed on my feet in a team that I love and working on stuff that I love. So I think I'll be surprised if I moved away from platform engineering in any time in the future, because it seems to be where I always seem to end up, even if I try and avoid it. So it's obviously where I'm meant to be.
Yeah, yeah. You keep landing in this sort of space. Okay, here's an interesting question. Okay, tell me how all this new AI that we've got coming at us now at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I want your thoughts on that. How it's going to improve your the work you're doing. Have you even thought about that yet? Are you nervous about it? Are you happy about it? Are you guys even playing with it yet? Give me like 5 minutes on that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think so personally, I'm very interested in this space. I don't know if you saw, but on Twitter, but I started training a model myself to be able to answer questions on Go in an opinionated manner. Because you can ask ChatGPT questions about Go, but it gives you sort of waffly answers that from some of the answers might be wrong, some of them from like 2009. So I was trying to train it on data that I thought was good. So for example, I really like Ben Johnson's package structure. So if people ask about package structure, it should answer using the things he's wrote, because I think they're excellent. If it asks a question about how to write Go, maybe I'd use your Ultimate Go service as a training corpus, because again, it's very good. So I wanted to try and do that. I quickly stopped that as I spent like $150 in about 10 minutes trying to train it. I was like, okay, this is quite expensive. I don't think I can afford to fund this. But to me, that's one of the really interesting applications I think we'll see going forward. Right now, everyone seems to be focusing on general intelligence, but I think there's some real value in biased intelligence too, especially for learning things, like having an expert kind of train a model on things that they think are useful and they think are valuable. You can imagine having this personal mentor that can really help you like grow your own career, but it's not giving general advice. It's giving actually, it's been trained by industry experts or something like that. So I think that's really interesting to me. From a Cloudflare perspective, we've been looking at it a few different angles. There's some customer facing stuff, which I guess I'm less connected to right now, but internally we're looking at it I mentioned that we have a wiki, which we've got basically documentation from the beginning of time on Cloudflare. So we're very interested in surfacing that and allowing people to ask questions without having to go through the wiki and be able to get answers on, internal documentation and internal ways to do things, trained on our own stuff and running internally too. So, we know that the data it's been trained on is only stuff that's kind of been blessed and came from internal. So that's interesting to us. We've also been looking at something that we call federated search. So we have a bunch of different internal, let's call them repositories of information. We have like our code, we have the wiki that I mentioned, we've got chat history from 10, 15 years back, and some other stuff too. And to have like a centralized search bar, think of it like google.com, but for within Cloudflare, where employees can just kind of search, I don't know, maybe they type in Matt Boyle and it gives them 9 different results from different things that are relevant, that may be interesting to their query from all across different Cloudflare things. Is something else we're looking at. From a more from the app I was talking to you about before, Gaia, like I'm very interested in allowing people to speak to a chatbot and say, I want to build a new Go app and I want it to run in this country and I want it to connect to this type of database. Please, can you create me one? And I'll just go, sure, here you go, and give you back the generated configuration and probably a link to a repository and nothing else. So I think there's lots of applications from like a developer productivity standpoint that are really, really interesting to me. I think one of the challenges we have particularly is, at least in my team, we don't have that skill set. Like, I don't know how to run an LL, a large language model in production. Like, I don't know how to ensure that it's safe. I don't know how to deal with things like, what do they call them? Like hallucinations, where it thinks it knows the answer and it doesn't, and it just tells you something that's completely untrue. And that could be quite dangerous for internal documentation, I think. So then you start getting into like ethical and philosophical discussion, which the artistic side of my brain, going back to my English literature and history, is really interested in. And I think that's going to become more prevalent. Is I think going forward, not Cloudflare, but generally every engineer is going to going to have to start asking themselves questions like, yeah, we can build this AI, but should we? Like, is this the right thing to do? Do we know what the guardrails are? Um, do we know what its failure modes are? And you can see interviews with the creators of OpenAI, and they're like, "Hey, we don't know exactly how it runs, and we don't know exactly what response it's going to give to a pre-computed input," and that's kind of scary to me, I think. And so I think that's going to be the
I'll tell you what I want, Matt. I want a quick way of dumping every memory in my head, all the experiences I've had in my head, the way I answer questions in my head. I want my entire existence into its own personal model, so my grandchildren and my grandchildren's grandchildren can ask me questions, right, after I'm long gone, and get a real sense of. I mean, imagine that. I mean, that's a level of immortality, right? Where I could go right now. My grandfather knew all this stuff, and I could go and ask him right now. Hey, Grandpa, tell me about the time when you were in World War One, or tell me what was going on, right? And it comes from his human experience, not just it's like documentation somewhere.
yeah. So there's actually a Black Mirror episode on this. Have you seen it? It's called Dead Like Me.
No.
You should watch it. You might change your mind. um, it's kind of exploring the darker side of it. But I mean, the story is effectively. I think that a woman's husband dies, and she makes a chatbot off of his memories. And as you can guess by the name of the program, it gets quite dark. So I'd recommend watching it. But I think that's what I guess interesting, right? It's like, arguably part of the human existence is to die, and for it to end. So to kind of achieve these levels of immortality wasn't something that was meant to happen. So should we be trying to achieve that? I don't know.
I think it's interesting. I think that's interesting. And I have no doubt that this stuff's going to make our lives easier with better tooling and stuff. Somebody said something I read a few weeks ago, and it was kind of interesting. They said if AI replaces a job, it's because it's a job that a human really shouldn't have been doing anyway. And I kind of connected with that, right? Because we've automated jobs away since the birth of microcomputers, I guess, in the 70s. So, right. So I think that's a fair thing to say, right? If it's able to replace a job, it was probably shouldn't have been done by a human anyway.
I guess tricky, doesn't it? Because I think I would agree with that notion if it didn't take away the fact that means someone may not be able to earn a living for their family, right? And I think, unfortunately, historically, we've seen jobs be automated, removed, made more efficient by computers, but it hasn't led to more people having more free time or working less. If anything, it's led to the opposite. Like, expectations are higher. So if we were to automate someone's job away and they don't have a skill set, or we don't have something like, universal basic income or something like that to provide people with the means to provide, then I think that could be a bad thing. And I just don't think we're prepared to answer these questions yet, because I think the success of ChatGPT specifically took us all a bit by surprise. And I think, we saw with crypto that regulation trails by years probably. And I think that's my worry, is that we take a step that we can't go backwards from because we were a little bit too fast to jump into it and to apply it to all these applications without thinking of like the consequences to humans, which ultimately is what we should be optimizing for, right? Like the whole point of all of this is to hopefully ensure humans have a good life. And if we're focusing on just optimizing efficiency out of everything, but still expecting people to be happy and have fulfilling lives, I think that's where things could go a bit wrong, I think.
All right. We got 15 minutes left, and I need to talk to you about your book. Because anybody who's ever written a book knows the labor of love that's involved in making that happen. It's a really long and difficult process. And I applaud anybody who's able to kind of get that. How long did it take you to write that book? It takes me like 12 to 18 months to write a book because it's just so difficult.
Yeah, I'd say that's about right. 12 to 15 months, I would say, it took me from like, let's talk about it to actually being available. Yeah, 12 to 15 months, I'd say.
Right. And it's, I in college, I pledged a fraternity and we called it the best time I never want to have again. And it's like writing a book is, I can't say it's the best time, but it's like, I never want to have again.
I would agree with that sentiment 100%. I think the thing for me as well, I'm sure it's happened to you. Once you've written one book, you get approached by all these publishers wanting you to write another book because you're one of the people who've proven you can actually go from idea to getting it out there. But the thing is, I think the benefit of writing more than one book actually isn't really there. Like after you've written one book, you get to say you're an author, you get all the kudos that comes with it, but I don't think you get the same from a second book. And as I think it was you said to me on Twitter, you certainly don't write a book to make money, because it doesn't make any sense from a financial standpoint. Your time could be spent much better doing other things. So I think it's a really cool thing to do. I'd really encourage anyone to do it once if there's something that's really interested about, because it takes a willpower, perseverance, sticking to a routine for a really prolonged period of time, and it is very satisfying the first time you get that physical copy in your hands. But it certainly won't be doing it. It won't be something I'll be doing again anytime soon.
You do it from a place of ignorance, because it's the only way that you get going on that. Because if you really knew what was involved, you'd never do it in a million years. But talk to me about your book. Tell me about, you're the first Go book out there really talking about domain-driven design. I'm happy, right? It's not another language book. We do not need another language book. This is like new content, new subjects. So thank you for that, first of all. But talk to me about how the idea of the book came about, and where you drew all the ideas for the book and the material.
I've, I said I'm a big reader, and part of that is I spend a lot of time reading technical books too, to understand like different patterns, ways of doing things. I started life as a Java developer, and Java engineers love a pattern and software patterns. So, when I was working at GE, and when I was even working at Crowdcube, like we were following certain sort of patterns of way to architecting software, and domain-driven design was something that had been thrown around a little bit, but I still wasn't 100% sure what it was, like even though I was supposedly building in it, right? So as I picked up the books, there's a big red book and a big blue book, which are very famous. The blue book is the one that started it all. And I kind of tried to read it end to end, which I don't really recommend, to be honest. It's a pretty hard read. But there were some sort of ideas and concepts that I took away from that I think were really interesting. And they seem like common sense when you say them out loud, but, to kind of build your software around the problem space and to model it after the real world, like makes it so much more easy to reason about. It makes it easier to work with non-technical folks and to discuss requirements and to think about how to maintain it going forward. And that really resonated with me. So, I mean, pretty much every team I've ever worked in, even whether they know it or not, we've always been applying sort of domain-driven design thinking. And I've always tried to shape the way we build services and microservices and even entire architectures around this sort of idea of building it around the problem space and ensuring that we can have conversations with non-technical colleagues about what we're building. And as I started to build more Go and get more comfortable with Go and work with Go at scale, I realized there wasn't really any books kind of discussing how to do this for Go, because domain-driven design, at least the books that I'd read, were really focused on object-oriented principles. And Go is not an OOP language. Lots of people try and make it one, but it isn't. And you got to think a little bit differently. And so a lot of the things that I was trying to do that worked in Java weren't really working in Go anymore. So the book is actually just, I guess, a result of 3 or 4 years of me experimenting, trying different things, trying to find a way that works to kind of model some of these ideas that we've done in Java in the Go space. And in towards the end of the book as well, I talk a little bit more about doing it for distributed systems as well with a Go lean. But yeah, it's just 3-4+ years of me experimenting and learning about this space. I think one thing that I guess my takeaway and piece of advice for anybody like looking at any of this stuff is just because someone wrote a book on it, or just because someone is a leading expert on something, it doesn't mean it's the only way to do things. And my book is my best guess, my best advice given the experience I've had. Like you should take it as a starting point and experiment with it and try your own different ways to do things that match the patterns. And I would kind of give that advice to working with anything. Like if you look at Bill's Ultimate Go service and you're like, I don't really like how he's done that, like experiment with it and then make a PR, because I bet Bill would love to see it. Like all of us are just trying to figure this stuff out too. So
yeah, I'm using domain-driven design in that service, and it's taken me 4 years to get it to that level. And right, because it's one thing to just say, I think this is, it's another thing then to try to build. It's working on a client project for the last year. It's really helped solidify those ideas. But one of the things I have to tell students all the time is this is only as good as disciplined as you are. In other words, you really have to be disciplined in separating these domains and keeping those separations. It's so easy to just decide that I'm going to do this way right now because it's easier to get me out of this, say, jam, instead of saying, let me stay disciplined in my layers. Let me stay disciplined in my domains. Let me stay disciplined in the things that I'm doing. Because I catch myself. If it wasn't for my team every once in a while, they'd be like, Bill, you can't do that. Why not? No, stay disciplined.
And that's the thing as well is a lot of people. I got a couple of emails of people like, how do I convince my team to follow domain driven design? Like, we're building a new service, I want to do it that way. Like, how do I convince them to do it? My advice is don't. The best use of tools and practices comes from when you feel a pain, and sometimes you do have to feel that pain before you can convince people that it's worth investing the time in this slower process, this more structured process. And I think it's important that teams do discover that on their own. So, if you're working with a bunch of experienced people, you might be able to say things like, hey, is everyone okay if we use Mongo for this? And everyone's like, yeah, that's fine. Because in their head, you can see them making the mental jumps to see how you got there. But if you're working with people and it's their first job, or maybe they don't have experience, or maybe just a small team of a couple of people, it might not be worth investing all this time to follow these like structured patterns. And that's totally okay too.
Yeah. But you got to at least have some form of a initial architecture and design philosophy that drives some guidelines, or you'll have a complete mess, right? So again, that's kind of why I like the starter kits, because it's just like, I'm giving you a place to start. Here's a general philosophy. Here's a general architecture. The more disciplined you'll stay, I think the cleaner you'll be. But sometimes you got a time constraint and you got to get that thing done. And you can't start doing what you really need to do, because at that point, the product's not in production. And then everything else was a waste of time.
Which is why starter kits like yours are so valuable, I think, because if you don't know where to start, it's just like, well, I think Bill knows what he's talking about. Let's just do what he says, and let's see if we end up in a bad place. And chances are you're not going to. It's much better than starting in a place of, I don't know what we're doing. Let's just put everything in main.go and hope for the best. Here's a basic structure. Let's try and stick to it and see what Bill was thinking. And then as you start to move through your project, you're like, oh, it actually clicks. I understand why we did this now, because it's just prevented me from having this import cycle problem or something like that. So that's really valuable. I think sometimes you do need to fail on your own. You need to learn, but especially if you're building something for a client, you've got a time limit. You're building for production, like using these starter templates, using these patterns, and kind of leaning on people who've walked the road before you, if you will, is always a really great place to start, and you can't go too far wrong.
But writing this stuff down like you did is, I've started trying to write the ultimate service class that I teach in written form. And this isn't like teaching language syntax, man. And so, people want this in written form. It is complicated to kind of write it down. So the fact that you even got through that, to me, was super impressive.
I appreciate that. It probably makes more sense now I've explained my background and where I came from a little bit, why writing a book was appealing, and potentially why hopefully it's an okay book and makes sense.
Brilliant. All right, we are pretty much out of time. Matt, thanks so much for hanging out with us here for just about an hour and a half. If anybody listening to the show wants to reach out to you, what's the best way? And we'll put this in the show notes too.
Yeah, awesome. So you can find me on Twitter. I love Twitter. That's where me and Bill met. So you can come hang out there with us. I'm at Matt James Boyle on Twitter. I think I'm at Matthew James Boyle on GitHub. Yeah, I'd love to hear from y'all.
All right. So this is Matt and Bill signing off from the Ardan Labs podcast, and hope to see everybody again real soon.